Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery. This is Season 3, Episode 9. I'm your host, Rachel Leroy, and please bear with me because there's a storm, a very long storm going, so you may hear some rain and maybe even some thunder in the background. I try to record when it's quiet, but it doesn't always work out that way because I have to take the opportunity when it's there. So bear with me. This is Season 3, Episode 9 of Christian Emotional Recovery, and the episode today is What's Childhood Emotional Neglect Got to Do with Abandonment Trauma? What's childhood emotional neglect got to do with abandonment trauma? And one reason that I'm covering a little bit more on childhood emotional neglect was I did an episode last year, on childhood emotional neglect. It was Childhood Emotional Neglect, A Hidden Epidemic. And I will link that podcast episode in the show notes so you can also use it as a resource. But that episode got more clicks and more downloads than any episode I've had so far in my entire podcast. And so I wanted to cover this topic a little more. And I've also wanted to talk about abandonment trauma, but I haven't been sure how to approach it in a way that's practical and helpful. You know, the connection between these two is very deep and very powerful. So I wanted to do an episode on the connection between these two. Now keep in mind, when we talk about abandonment trauma and emotional neglect and abuse and trauma, the point of all of this is not to be negative. It's not to dwell on the past or anything like that. But we cannot heal our lives and we cannot heal our futures if we don't deal with all of these issues that are going on in our bodies and our minds. And so I like to address the problems and then present solutions. And that's really what most of these episodes are built around. So that will be this episode today. Really quickly, if you have not checked out my YouTube channel, check it out. It's growing, and I'm putting new videos on there monthly. A new video usually comes out every 2 weeks when the podcast is in season. There's also a Christian Emotional Recovery store. Check that out. I will put that in the link as well. And you can support this ministry by purchasing items at the store. There's still just a couple of things there, but there will be more, and it is growing. And also keep in mind that you can also support this ministry by donating $5, $10, or $25 monthly through Patreon, which is a reputable, trustworthy site, or you can make a one-time donation at Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com. I'll put all that in the show notes. Also, if you'd like, please join the Facebook group, and I'll link that as well. Thank you so much. And let's go ahead and jump into childhood emotional neglect and what has it got to do with abandonment trauma. So first, we need to establish a little bit about what childhood emotional neglect is and what abandonment trauma is, and talk about definitions of them, impacts of them, and then talk about how they're correlated and connected. Are they just correlated, or is there a connection that's deeper here? In other words, does one cause the other? And I would say yes. Childhood emotional neglect can definitely cause abandonment trauma, even though it's definitely not the only form of abuse or neglect or other traumatic situations that can cause abandonment trauma. We'll talk a little bit about the nature of childhood emotional neglect and how it can lead to many of the effects that it can cause. And we'll talk about the impact of childhood emotional neglect on the brain and how this can create abandonment trauma. And we'll go through a lot of detail there and talk about the nature of that. I'm going to share some of my experience because this is one where I've learned so much, so deeply. And I want you to be able to take the God-given wisdom that God has given me and the experience of going through that whole process of realizing what all these things that were going on with me were, and the fact that I didn't believe myself at first. And then we'll talk about ways emotional neglect can feel like emotional abandon to a child, and then ways to cope with and overcome, as we always do talk about, childhood emotional neglect that leads to abandonment trauma. And we'll talk about some resources and close out the talk. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right in and get started. The nature of childhood emotional neglect and how it leads to this effect, the effects such as abandonment trauma. A few things to note here. Parents may only recognize or emphasize certain forms of abuse as abuse and may gloss over or deny certain kinds of abuse, saying that they really are abuse or that they are bad. Let me step back and explain this. Now, if you grew up in a household where there were certain things that were right and then there were certain things that were very, very wrong, it's even more confusing than if you grew up in a household where, I'm not saying you were chained to the basement, but it was just horrible and your parents were terrible people. In most cases, it's more complex than this, and that's why it can be such a mind, let's call it a mind screw, okay? So, and it's just like, did that really happen? Am I being dramatic? We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a little bit. But what you may, if you try to talk to your parents about this here, is that you weren't abused. Only this is abuse. I didn't do that. And they'll identify certain kinds of things that they didn't do, true. And then the things they did, they'll deny that that's abuse at all. And because you lived with this narrative that was implicit, it wasn't just explicit. That's when you ask those questions, it comes out explicitly. But you'll understand what they think about your own childhood and how that influenced what you believe. Because you only had your parents and your caretakers to go on. And so if they tell you something, even as an adult, you're going to have it so internalized, you're going to believe that narrative. So you're going to doubt your own reality. You see? Do you see how that's going to happen? And so if there's a connection between what they have been guilty of themselves and the types of abuse that they deny or downplay, that's not surprising. Is it intentional? I don't know. I think it depends on the people. But what will happen is that if they say that beating a child and sexual abuse and gross neglect are abusive, if they emotionally neglected you or emotionally abused you, they'll deny that that's abuse, real abuse, quote, put that in quotation marks. There's abuse, but there's only certain kinds of real abuse. I'm going to make a statement, and this is my opinion, but I think abuse is abuse, period. Is all of it intentional? No. Is all of it malicious? No. Is some of it intentional and malicious in some cases? Yes. But it's, we've got to learn to separate these things and get clarity on them. But the ones that they're better at, they will admit it's abuse and harms children into adulthood. The ones they are more guilty of, I'm not saying this is always the case, but this does happen sometimes. They will downplay, not discuss, or deny outright that they happened. And like I said, I'm not saying all parents are guilty of this. I'm not saying even all abusers are guilty of this, or all people who unintentionally emotionally neglect their kids are guilty of this. They may even admit sometimes that there were shortcomings. They may even admit to certain things and not others. So you have to really dig to figure it out. And we'll talk a little bit more about the nature of this in a little bit. But there are 3 basic emotional needs of children, according to an article that I'm going to look at. Now, one of the people that has been absolutely key in research and therapy when it comes to childhood emotional neglect is Dr. Jonice Webb. And she wrote an iconic book about it called Running on Empty, and I will put that book in the show notes. That book is life-changing if you feel like you've experienced childhood emotional neglect. So, as always, I'm using a few articles to help with this talk, and one of them is the Jonice Webb article, and it's on her website, drjonicewebb.com, and it's 3 ways emotional neglect can feel like abandonment to a child. 3 ways emotional neglect can feel like abandonment to a child. And in those 3, in the middle of the article, one of the 3 needs that a child has in terms of basic emotional needs of children, one of them is to know your emotions are real. One of them is to know your emotions are real. And so if you're invalidated, do you see the connection between things that happened or didn't happen depending on the situation and their denial, and how that can just be completely a mind screw? And even into adulthood, you're like, did that happen? Am I crazy? Am I overreacting? What's wrong with me? It's because you might have been told that. And so to feel like your emotions are real was one of those. Now we'll go back and go over those all in just a little bit, but I wanted to go ahead and explain that this is based in research and based on Jonice Webb's work here, okay? So 3 basic emotional needs though, and like I said, that's one of them. Your emotions aren't valid if you're told that, and that what happened wasn't real. It makes you wonder if you're crazy or you're imagining things. And that is so harmful. That invalidation, especially of that kind, is so harmful. And that's why invalidation is so, it's so important to acknowledge it and to bring it out and to understand it and to see that cognitive dissonance, that this happened, but I don't believe this happened. Or this happened, but I don't think it was so bad. Or this happened, but I don't, maybe I imagined it. There's just so much cognitive dissonance, and we'll talk about cognitive dissonance a little bit as well. This is a pretty in-depth episode, so let's go ahead and get into it. So the impact of childhood emotional neglect on the brain and how this can create abandonment trauma is something else I wanted to look at. And the effects of childhood emotional neglect, there's an article where it lists 37 things that you can do to help heal childhood emotional neglect. And I wanted to look at the 3rd paragraph of that article. So there's an article from Parenting for Brain, and it's by Pamela Lee, Childhood Emotional Neglect, 37 Signs, Effects, and How to Overcome. And in the 3rd paragraph, it says, being emotionally neglected can be a devastating experience. Not only can this childhood trauma affect a child's sense of self, capacity to trust, and their ability to build healthy relationships, but it can also affect a child's health conditions. So there's a psychological effect, and it affects health as well. The effects of psychological abuse can carry into one adult life. In the United States, child neglect includes physical, medical, educational, and emotional neglect. Parental neglect causing physical harm through the denial of proper care and lack of supervision is a criminal act defined by the Federal Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, CAPTA, 1996. So there is a component here where you can see that it's been acknowledged based on the United States and what they consider child abuse and how that's defined based on the research. The effects of childhood emotional neglect, but I wanted to read about the impacts of childhood emotional neglect on the brain. In the article, under a section called Effects of Emotional Neglect in Childhood, it says, despite the lack of overt traumatic events, experiencing emotional neglect as a child can be just as damaging as abuse. So this is why you may feel like there's something wrong with you, so to speak. You know what I mean. There's nothing wrong with you. It's the impacts of trauma, right? But maybe you were never hit, or maybe you were never starved or denied any basic needs as a child, but that doesn't mean there was an impact there, okay? And then it says, in fact, studies indicate that CEN, which is childhood emotional neglect, might have the most wide-ranging negative mental health impact among all childhood maltreatment types. It's associated with adverse physical, psychological, and educational outcomes. Short-term consequences of neglect include increased risk for childhood internalizing and externalizing behavior, as well as delay in cognitive and emotional development. And this is the impact on the brain I wanted to talk about. The amygdala is part of the brain responsible for learning emotional significance, it says. It affects arousal reaction to environmental stimuli, so fight or flight, fear. When a child experiences severe forms of CEN during early brain development, such as institutional rearing, that means like being in a a home or something, the amygdala becomes bigger in volume and more reactive. As a result, individuals raised by neglectful parents tend to have worse mental health outcomes and long-term effects. A child's perception of neglect is important. When a child perceives they're being neglected emotionally, they are twice as likely to develop psychiatric disorders by age 15, including the development of depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety, panic disorder, phobias, and PTSD. Adolescents with their emotions neglected as a child are more likely to have poor academic performance, substance abuse, risky sexual activity, and suicide attempts. And then it talks about how emotional neglect is often transgenerational because it's passed down from parent to child to the next generation and so on. Not always. And that, just like with those tendencies that can be side effects of childhood emotional neglect, that doesn't mean you're going to have those if you're in that situation. And even if you're don't have emotional neglect, you can still have those conditions depending on the situation. So it's complex. This is where I wanted to talk about the emotional needs of children. 3 basic emotional needs of children in the Jonice Webb article. They are the following. Emotional response. Children need to experience their parents noticing their feelings. You look sad. I know you are angry right now. I see how disappointed you are examples of emotional response. This is my idea. Even if a child is being disciplined and they're pitching a fit and maybe they're even being kind of bratty, acknowledging their emotions does not contradict also disciplining a child in a kind way that teaches them, corrects their behavior. Does that make sense? There's a way to do it. And so you can acknowledge that. And I had a grandmother who was wonderful with this. She would acknowledge my emotions and she would be compassionate, but she still held her boundaries. And so that's a good balance there. But it says this communicates to the child that their feelings are real and that other people can see them, and perhaps most importantly, that they matter. And then the second basic emotional need, emotional validation. Children need to be assured that their feelings make sense. Of course you feel sad. I'm sad about this too. I understand why you're angry right now. It's because blank. Or it makes sense that you feel disappointed. It's so disappointing when something you were excited about doesn't work out. This communicates to the child that they live in reality and their deepest expression of who they are is understandable to others. Now, this is my ideas. You cannot understand things being real unless somebody teaches them to you and points them out to you when it comes to a lot of emotional things. So if you're taught, oh, well, that's not real, or that's invalid, or you shouldn't feel that way, or just ignore it altogether, you will start to disassociate from your emotions and you will doubt your reality when things happen. And so if you start to gaslight yourself and don't even do it on purpose, it's because that's what happened to you when you were a child. The third need is emotional education. Children will have emotions throughout their entire lives, but they are not born understanding emotions and how they work. If they are to learn, they must be taught by their parents or whoever. You look sad and I understand why. Let's sit and talk about this together. Let's sort through your angry feelings and how we can help you feel better about this. Feeling disappointed is a natural part of this situation and it's okay to feel that way. Sometimes you just have to wait it out and it will fade. In the meantime, let's think about what else could be set up to look forward to because that will help too. And so those are the 3 basic emotional needs of children. Emotional response, emotional validation, and emotional education. And that's from the Jonice Webb article. So a little bit more about the impact of childhood emotional neglect. Why is childhood emotional neglect so hidden? Why is it so difficult for people to believe that happened to them? It's hard to believe it happened. It's hard to believe it's so damaging. It's invisible because it's abuse by omission instead of abuse by commission. If somebody gets hit by somebody, they have a black eye. If somebody is, I don't want to get too much into this, if there's sexual abuse, in some cases, there's also physical evidence. In cases of yelling, there might be a recording or there might be witnesses. When it's emotional neglect and a child, mom makes spaghetti for dinner and dad mows the lawn and they go to the doctor and they have jobs and the house is clean and everything seems, quote, normal. You may even live in a house with 2.5 kids and a white picket fence and a dog named Rover and a cat named Fluffy. And still, childhood emotional neglect can still be hidden. So it's tricky. It's slippery. It's an abuse by omission instead of abuse by commission, which means you can't see it, which means many abusers, neglectors, toxic and unhealed caretakers won't believe it themselves, or its impact is real, or that it ever happened. It must be brought into the light. I'll say it again. It must be brought into the light. This is not to point fingers. It's not to blame. It's not to resent. It's not to be hateful towards caretakers and parents. It's something we have to do for ourselves so that we can heal. And it is biblical to bring it into the light, because Luke 12:2-4, and this is the NIV, I'll put this in the show notes, even says that there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear of the inner rooms will be proclaimed from the roofs. I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that can do no more. And that's Luke 12:2-4. So this is a biblical concept. So what you have to do is you have to get inside your mind, and there's a few things. This is based on my own experience. What happened to me was I had tried to heal my whole life. I believed that there was something intrinsically wrong with me, that I was born with anxiety and depression and all that. And even if I was born with a propensity for those, I was told there was something wrong with me and I was born that way. Nothing happened to me. Things weren't perfect growing up, but nothing happened that could have damaged me and caused these issues to come out, right? So what ended up happening was I read a book called Healing from Hidden Abuse, and alarm bells went off in my head. The book is called Healing from Hidden Abuse. I've mentioned it in several episodes and several other places. And it's by Shannon Thomas, and I will note that also in the show notes as a resource. That book changed my life. When I got done reading it, I read it again. I'm like, this cannot be real. This is not real. It was like, for the first time in my entire life, I had done healing work. I'd meditated. I had explored. I'd been in therapy. I had read books. I had meditated. I prayed. I had done all the work. I had done deep journaling. I had done a lot of deep healing work on myself. And nobody ever told me any of this. Nobody told me where this was. And it was like, after all the searching and thinking and praying and meditating and digging and healing work, it's like I'm in my late 30s. And this is when somebody tells me that this is real and this is what happened. This can be so tricky that you can do healing work, examine, ask yourself the questions, and still not believe that it's real. And I'm not saying that that's what happened to you. I don't want you to make things up that didn't happen. But if they did happen, you need to know about it, because it was absolutely life-changing for me when I realized what had happened to me. But it was also disturbing. You can't go back. Once you realize it, you cannot go back. And how you perceive certain people and yourself, you realize there's nothing wrong with you. You realize you can heal, even if you never thought you could before. And suddenly you have to look at certain people differently, even if they didn't do certain things on purpose, even if they weren't aware of certain things being harmful. But here's what you have to do. You have to tell your experience of not believing your own emotions, what happened to you, and you have to believe yourself at some point. So when I read Healing from Hidden Abuse, I would affirm over and over and over that something was real by saying it repetitively, because my conscious mind didn't believe it at first, even though my unconscious mind knew beyond the shadow of a doubt that the emotional neglect and the harm was real. And this is called cognitive dissonance. So the whole point of this strategy that I'm trying to share with you, and I know it's kind of weird the way I'm presenting it, but that's because this whole process is weird. That's the nature of it. This is not to obsess. It's not to go down a rabbit hole. It's not to blame anyone. It's not to reaffirm all the things that happened, but to know it was real and validate it in your own mind, because that's the only way you're going to be able to heal, is to identify it, bring it out, understand it was real, and keep validating it over and over. I would doubt that it ever happened, because that was the narrative I was told for so long. It's a form of gaslighting, intentional or not, and we might have experienced it as children, sometimes intentional by the parties involved, sometimes not. And now, because everything was supposedly, quote, okay, and nothing bad happened, and we weren't abused, and we were imagining things, and we were the problem, and we were born that way, and we were being dramatic, and we were imagining it, and it can't be real. But it is real. There's a video that I'm going to include in the show notes as well, and it's called What is Cognitive Dissonance? And this is by Dr. Ramani. She's great. If you haven't subscribed to her YouTube channel, she has a lot of stuff about trauma and relationships and just a lot of the stuff that I talk about, and she's a therapist. She's great. But watch the video on What is Cognitive Dissonance by Dr. Ramani to get more of a sense of that. I'm not going to go into detail, but cognitive dissonance is basically, where one thing's happening, but you believe something else. And there's an article here that I found called Unraveling the Cognitive Dissonance in a Toxic Family. And it's from Caring Matters, Mind Kind Mom. And this was written by, it just has Cheryl. There's not a last name. And it's Mind Kind Mom. And it says, it basically talks about how denial and rationalizing help us to survive abusive and inconsistent caregivers. So it's not always abusive caregivers that are directly trying to hurt us or directly don't care about us. A lot of times it's just the inconsistency of their behavior with us in everyday life. It says to survive an abusive childhood, one has to suppress the cognitive dissonance one regularly experiences. And cognitive dissonance, like I said, is where one thing is happening, but you believe something else, and they're incompatible, but you're still kind of in denial about that. And that's exactly, if you are experiencing cognitive dissonance, that's based on your childhood, that's a good there's a good chance that you might have experienced childhood emotional neglect. And it says, depending on their moods, our caregivers would swing from being a raging lunatic to a saccharine puppy all in the course of a day. Sometimes the flip-flop could happen in minutes, more so with the arrival of an audience or if they wanted something from you. And that leaves a child in a state of mental confusion and conflict. Are they good or are they bad? Being dependent, a child is not able to wrap her mind around the fact that something could be wrong with the caregiver. Nonetheless, living with these intermittent cycles of good and bad behavior conditions us to become trauma bonded. Or we also have abandonment trauma. And our need for love and acceptance, it says, makes us distort our reality. Since there is no escape, or our still immature brain tries to deal with these crazy-making inconsistencies by creating a false narrative. We adjust, deny, distort, select, and repackage the situation. And then it just goes into more detail. Read this article. And it's about how our minds get twisted around and confused and distorted, where we literally create an alternate reality. And that's the reality we've lived with our whole lives. And then when we start to unravel it, it is an absolute mind screw. Like I said, it's just wow. You can't even begin to imagine how much you have not seen. If something doesn't feel fundamentally right, trust it. Investigate it, learn about it, affirm and validate it. It can be, the nature of this is like a scared fawn or another gentle but elusive animal that we barely ever see. It will run away and it will hide quickly. It's tricky. At first, you need to be careful, slow, gentle, easy, subtle, calm, and kind. You'll gain its trust, and it will hide less and less, and eventually it will reveal itself to you more and more, and you will know it's real. Talk with a therapist to help differentiate between what really happened and did not. So the few times I had people validate that treatment of me by other people, I would ask them about it further. I would ask them to tell me again and state why. Only do this with really, really trusted people. Like if there were witnesses of things that happened in your childhood, and you have somebody who's kind and somebody who loves you and cares about your well-being and will tell you the truth in private with those people that you know won't go back to the people you're discussing, ask them about it and see what they say, and then ask them to repeat what they said, and then you can tell them why if they're trustworthy. But that happened to me a few times, and I would afterwards go and write down the experience and then go back and read it so I didn't forget, because your mind will forget disassociate, and continue the patterns and narratives you were taught in your family of origin that will try to, this is the narrative, not your family, the narrative that will try to dominate, hide, invalidate, scare away, and even erase the truth of what happened. And sometimes your family will too, in some cases. But it did happen. If you've got enough information, it did happen. That's the nature of childhood emotional neglect and why sometimes we don't understand what is wrong with us. This isn't about paranoia. It isn't about exaggeration, but doubt of real abuse and neglect that happened, and then you were told it didn't, or treated in contradictory ways in so many other areas by the same people that you don't believe that the other was real, but it was. You were conditioned to denial and to a certain narrative, so that is what you will believe. You will have to reprogram yourself based on the evidence and what your subconscious mind is telling you. Now, that's why I said be careful, because sometimes we'll create false narratives of things that didn't happen. But there's this cognitive dissonance when something is real. And there are sometimes witnesses who can attest to certain things that happen that will give you clues, and sometimes downright whole stories. And those are things you can do to validate and solidify these experiences. There's a knowing, a deep down instinct. It's sort of a first thought, if you will, that will flash with truth and insight very quietly, very quickly in the back of your mind every once in a while. And you will know it rings true and it's right, but you will want to dismiss it, distrust it, be scared of it, and even feel guilty for having it. But if it's that way, it's real. It's real. Knowing the nature of how childhood emotional neglect can impact your mind will help you know which of these feelings and thoughts are real about what happened to you, so that you don't what happened to you that you don't believe did, would, or could have happened. The revelation will be disturbing, empowering, scary, unbelievable, like waking up from a dream you didn't even know you were in. If you find a thread on the ground, even a dirty, delicate, about to fray thread, very gently pull on it and follow it to see where it goes all the way through to the end, no matter how disturbing. Record the experience so you can come back to it later and know it was real, and review it to remind yourself your experiences were real and valid, and you can work on healing it. Okay? That's how the nature of it works. Those are the hidden pockets of trauma invalidation that are quiet, small, scared, hidden, and hard to detect. Maybe like you as a person. Like if, a lot of us, we make ourselves small. We hide. We make ourselves invisible to stay safe. But they are real. Those experiences are real and they are valid. So make sure you gently draw them out, talk to them, understand them, validate them, give them a voice, and remind them over and over and over again that you know they're real. This is also what you need to say to yourself as an individual as well if you experience childhood emotional neglect. You are real. And that's why some of us have to do that body work where we ground ourselves back in our bodies, because we don't feel real in our own bodies, and that's why. But you are real. You are valid. Draw yourself out. Be gentle with yourself. Remind yourself of the truth. Talk to yourself in this way. Understand and validate and give yourself a voice, and remind yourself over and over that you're real too. Write it in a journal. Repeat it while looking at a solid object as a frame of reference and anchor. That sounds strange, but that's what I did. It grounds you. I would look at my window frame in my room, knowing how real and solid it was, and remind myself when my inner voice would say a specific experience that came up in my memory wasn't real. I would tell it would say my experiences of invalidation and neglect were not real, or they weren't as bad as I thought they were, or they weren't as, but I would remind myself that they were as real and as grounded, and they really happened, and as solid as that white wooden window frame, even if they felt slippery, evasive, and tricky. With more and more work on this, I learned to bring them to the surface, validate them, make them more solid, and know they are real. And then you can work on your healing and get past them, because you're able to grasp them and understand them and validate them and see them. That's where the first step lies, but that's why so many people don't heal, because that's the hardest step. The first step is the hardest step, and sometimes even when you try, you still can't get there. And that's why when you grasp it, do not let go. And like I said, it's not about obsessing. It's not about a rabbit hole. It's not about blame. It's about getting a grasp on this stuff and knowing it's real and grounding yourself in that first, and then validating yourself, and then doing the hidden healing of those hidden things so that you can get past it. That's why I'm discussing why the nature of this is so slippery and so insidious. It's probably the least intentional form of child abuse or neglect on the parts of parents and caretakers, but it's also one of the most harmful, because when people are hit, they know they were hit. If they were sexually abused, sometimes that comes to the light later, but that can be hidden in a way as well. But this is something that there's no physical evidence of something that ever happened. And so with this childhood emotional neglect, it's a highly complex issue. And it's obvious to see why. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the nature of it and how slippery it is and how important it is to believe yourself and to validate yourself and to bring that stuff out very, very gently, and to find ways to differentiate between false narratives and false memories and real ones, and to know the difference. So a little bit about how emotional neglect can feel like emotional abandonment. There is a section in the Jonice Webb article, and this is where you can start to see the connection between abandonment trauma and childhood emotional neglect. So I'm going to read those three things that she talks about, how it feels like abandonment. And it is a form of abandonment. It's emotional abandonment, so to speak. Like I said, sometimes it's not always intentional, but it does happen, right? 3 ways emotional neglect can feel like abandonment to the child. This is Dr. Jonice Webb. Lack of response, lack of validation, lack of emotional education. So you see, it's the lack of the 3 basic emotional needs of children that I talked about earlier that Dr. Webb was talking about. And so here she says, lack of response. Children feel their emotions in a raw sort of way. In many ways, even more immensely than adults. Children's feelings are experienced as a powerful force as their bodies try to tell them what they want and need. When your parents did not respond to them enough, the child feels a sense of abandonment from the parent. A gulf appears between them in which the child feels alone. Number 2, lack of validation. Children do not know whether their emotions make sense or where they come from. If their feelings are not expressly understood by their parents, they are left with the impression that their feelings are not understandable and perhaps don't make sense to others. This leaves them feeling not just not validated, but not valid. I'll say it again. This leaves them not just feeling not validated, but not valid, including their emotions and their experiences. That's me. They will go through their lives feeling less than. Number 3, lack of emotional education. Children are naturally in the dark about the world of emotions, where they come from, what they mean, how to read and interpret them, and how to use them. If they are not taught by their parents or others how to understand, manage, and interpret the world of feelings in themselves and others, they grow up lacking emotional intelligence, which has been shown by research to be a key factor in building a successful personal and work life in adulthood. The uneducated child feels at sea, alone, and abandoned in the emotional world. So that's where all this healing work is about: re-educating ourselves, reparenting ourselves, responding, validating, and educating ourselves. And that is what this podcast is all about. Validating you, responding to you, giving you an emotional education, helping you to get to the root of trauma where you haven't been able to before because maybe you didn't get to the actual roots in the body and in a lot of cases in the mind. So, highlights of the causes of abandonment trauma. What are the causes of abandonment trauma? The causes of abandonment trauma in Talkspace. And this is where we're furthering the connection between abandonment trauma and childhood emotional neglect. It says in the Talkspace article, abandonment trauma can occur after any distressing experience that causes someone to feel neglected, isolated, or unsafe. This trauma can be a reaction to a single event, or it can result from an ongoing pattern of behavior. Common causes of abandonment trauma include an emotionally unavailable partner or parent. When a parent or partner consistently fails to respond to emotional needs, it can make someone feel their feelings don't matter. Experiencing emotional unavailability can make it difficult to regulate emotions and cause people to become emotionally distant or very clingy and needy. And they can also go back and forth, and that's where I did an episode, a YouTube on attachment styles. That's where these attachment styles come from. You might go check out that video in YouTube on the channel on attachment styles. And then it talks about childhood neglect. Neglect is sadly a common type of childhood abuse and is frequently a source of abandonment trauma. When caregivers fail to meet a child's basic needs, it can interfere with healthy development, leading to lifelong consequences. Childhood neglect can occur for many reasons, including poor parenting skills and substance abuse. Family instability. Family instability can disrupt a child's development and interfere with their sense of security. This could include divorce, financial issues, housing, or food insecurity. Chaos in the home. But when children don't have a stable living environment, it can make them feel like they could be abandoned at any time. And I know how that feels. I do. Death and serious illness of a parent or guardian. Losing a parent or guardian during childhood can create a lasting fear of abandonment. Research shows that abandonment trauma can occur after the death of a caregiver. Similarly, when a parent has a serious illness, it can lead to these fears as well, even if they ultimately survive. Death and illness are always distressing, but these experiences can be especially difficult for children to deal with. Okay, so that is the connection between childhood emotional neglect and abandonment trauma. It is real. And then signs of abandonment trauma. There's a lot of also impacts there, and the Talkspace article talks about that as well. And some of those are, first it says abandonment trauma can affect everyone differently, but some specific behaviors can be strong indicators if you may be dealing with them. Common abandonment trauma symptoms include fear of being left alone, inability to form healthy relationships, anxiety and depression, and performance difficulty. And I'm not going into the details of those, but it goes more into detail, and you can check those out in the article. So signs of abandonment trauma. So what do we do? If we experience this as a child, I did talk about ways you can draw that out very carefully, almost like if you see a frayed rope on the ground and it's very delicate and you're not sure where it goes, and you just gently pull at it and you follow that rope to see where it's taking you. Or if a metaphor that resonates more with you is a scared little fawn and its mother's abandoned it and you're trying to help it and save it. And you have to come up to it very, very slowly, and it takes a few times to build its trust before you can work with it. Those are good metaphors for how you deal with childhood emotional neglect. It's a little different than downright abuse and chaos. That's more overt because it's covert and it's hidden. It's kind of like some of these forms of hidden narcissism and abuse. And you have to be, it's a different animal and you have to work with it differently. So what are some ways you can cope with and overcome childhood emotional neglect that leads to abandonment trauma? Now, over the course of several articles that I've used in this talk, I've made a list myself. And so some of the ones that can help you are inner child work. And I just did a podcast a few weeks ago on inner child work and how healing your inner child, that there's a deep connection between validating the inner child and those hidden things that have not been brought to the surface. If you're kind to your inner child and you treat it kind of like the way I was talking about with the hidden trauma, very gently, very carefully, very slowly, that type of inner child work will help you to make more progress than pushing really hard will. You push, but you do it very, very carefully, very, very gently. Another one is self-validation of what happened and any emotions you're feeling. Self-validation of what happened and any emotions you're feeling. So if something comes up and maybe you're a little ashamed of how you feel, maybe it's not something you feel like you should feel, maybe as a Christian, just pushing it down and denying it or shaming yourself is not going to help, especially if it's traumatic stuff from the past. Maybe you've got anger towards your parents. Maybe you have anger towards somebody else and you don't feel like you're dishonoring them because they did so much for you too. Or maybe you just feel like you're not supposed to feel that way. Or maybe you're just starting this path and journey and you've got all this anger towards them and you don't know why and you feel like you're not supposed to, but then you start unraveling it and there's more there than you realize. So validating those emotions no matter what, and realizing it's okay to be angry, it's okay to be safe, you can do it in private, you don't have to go and rah 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 towards those people. There's a way to express that, and the only way you're going to heal is to bring that out, be honest, be careful, be gentle, express that emotion a little bit. You don't let it completely take you over. But one thing that can help you with the self-validation is if those difficult emotions come up, use the A.C.O.R.N meditation and the A.C.O.R.N technique. I have an infographic. You can go to ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com and you can sign up for that free resource. There's also a meditation on my YouTube channel. There's 4 versions of it. A.C.O.R.N meditation for dealing with difficult emotions will help you with that self-validation. If an emotion comes up that's difficult and you're scared of it and you feel bad that you have it or you're not sure it's real, go through that process with the A.C.O.R.N technique. Either you can meditate or journal it out, and that will help you to work through that emotion. Okay? Educate yourself about emotions, and emotional healing work is another way to cope and to heal. And that's listening to podcasts, listening to talks, watching YouTube videos, reading books, taking courses, doing meditations. It's all the healing work. Another one is work with a therapist or a coach. Therapists and coach are a little different. A coach will give you techniques and help you work through them, and you will sort of be they're your accountability partner. A therapist, you more do a lot of talking, and you do stuff like maybe EMDR, which is eye movement, rapid. I forgot, but it's the eye thing where it helps you to get trauma out of your body. But there's a lot of things you can do with a therapist or a coach that will help you work through it. Another one, meditation. That's where like the A.C.O.R.N one I was talking about comes into play, but mine is not the only one. There's a lot of them out there that will help you work through your healing. Another one I recommend is Rain by Tara Brach. Tara Brach is a therapist. I will tell you she's Buddhist. And so if that's an issue for you, then you don't have to do her meditation. You can do the A.C.O.R.N meditation, which is similar, but it's not exactly the same. But there's a lot of great resources out there with meditation. Insight Timer has thousands of free meditations, for example. YouTube does too. But Insight Timer, you don't have to deal with all the stupid ads and stuff. Another one, journal about your emotions, validating experiences and emotions, and witnessing childhood trauma, feelings, and experiences as well as adult ones. So the next one is journaling. Journal about your emotions, validate your experiences and emotions, witness your childhood trauma, feelings, and experiences as well as adult ones. Another one is read Jonice Webb classic book, Running on Empty, and similar works and resources. So childhood emotional neglect, if you want to start somewhere, I encourage you to start with Jonice Webb's book. She's great. She's sort of the mother of this work. She's been doing this research for decades. Her work is respected, is established, is scientific. So I encourage you to check out her book. Another one is build a support system. I know some of us do not have the best set of family and friends, or we have a couple of folks that are wonderful, and the rest we don't trust. I understand that. And so the people that you do have, let them support you. And support them too. It's not just take. It's give and take and give and take. And sometimes it might be one or the other more depending on if they're going through something or you're going through something. It might be your church, if it's a place you feel safe and you can rely on them. It could be your dog or your cat or your pet bird. It doesn't matter if it provides that sort of neural network link connection with something or somebody else. Of course, most importantly, God, He's got your back. He loves you. He's your anchor. He's your foundation. That's a support system as well. Friends, family that you can trust, and support groups are another good one. So that's another way you can build a support system. And so ways that you can overcome and cope with childhood emotional neglect that leads to abandonment trauma. Do child work, inner child work, self-validation of what happened and any emotions you're feeling. Educate yourself about your emotions and your emotional healing work. Do that. Work on with a therapist or a coach if you can. Meditate. Journal about your emotions, validate your experiences, emotions, and witness your childhood trauma, feelings, and experiences, as well as adult ones. Read Jonice Webb classic book, Running on Empty, and similar resources, and build a support system. Okay, so those are some of the things that you can do to help you to start healing childhood emotional neglect, abandonment trauma, and the connection. Once you start breaking the connection between those two, then then the abandonment trauma will start to dissolve. And it will happen slowly, but over time you'll start to see results and you'll start to feel better and better. And I know this talk was kind of long. I know it was kind of intense, but this is one where I have had some very powerful experiences, and I wanted to share those with you. And I don't know if some of the abstract stuff I talked about was kind of weird or hard to understand. Not because you can't understand it, because I don't know if I conveyed it in a way that's clear, but I hope that it was helpful. I hope it resonated with you. I hope that it gave you something you can work with so you can go on this journey yourself if this is the case with you. So, like I said, I'm not asking anybody to create experiences that aren't real, that never happened. But if some of these things ring true for you, if some of these things resonated with you, if you know that there's something to this, then you need to investigate. I would encourage you to start with the book Healing from Hidden Abuse and the book Running on Empty. Healing from Hidden Abuse is by Shannon Thomas. She's a therapist. She runs a Christian therapy like a place. And then Jonice Webb, her classic book, Running on Empty, is another good place to start. Check out her website as well. I've got the article there, and so you can just click on the link or whatever that takes you to her main page, and I'm sure she's got a lot of other great resources as well for childhood emotional neglect. But thank you so much for listening. This was episode 9 of season 3, and it was What's Childhood Emotional Neglect Got to Do with Abandonment Trauma? And so try some of this stuff. You don't have to do all of it, but try what resonates with you the most and start somewhere. And you'll find your own journey, your own process. Nobody's is exactly the same, but keep at it and you will start to find healing. Some of this hidden stuff will come to the light and you will start to see what was real and what was not real and get the truth of what actually happened. Thank you so much. God bless you and have a great day. And remember, beloveds, you are fearfully and wonderfully made and God loves you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.